If the state is not Islamic, you have a better chance of practicing Islam in the way that you really believe. The idea of a free trade, limited government, limited taxation, property rights, these were not unknown in Islam. Prophet Muhammad was the only businessman among the world's founders of great religions before becoming a prophet. And I said, where do you live? Do you live in Kandahar? No, you live in London or Texas. Then you're living in liberalism.
Hello and welcome to this IEA podcast. My name is Reem Ibrahim and I'm the Communications Manager and Linda Whetstone Scholar here at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Today I'm absolutely delighted to be joined by Mustafa Akyol. Mustafa is the Senior Fellow at the Centre for Global Liberty and Prosperity at the Cato Institute, where he focuses on the intersection of public policy, Islam and modernity. He is also the author of Islam Without Extremes, A Muslim Case for Liberty, Why, as a Muslim, I Defend Liberty, which is a book that I read myself when I was at university, and more recently, The Islamic Mesa, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together and Change the World. Mustafa, thank you so much for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me, Reem. It's a pleasure.
The pleasure's all mine. Let's first of all talk a bit about the intersection between Islam and politics. So in the UK, of course, we've got huge conversations about whether or not Islam itself is compatible with Western values. Could you tell me a bit about how you distinguish between Islam as a faith and Islam as a political ideology?
That distinction is important indeed. I come from Turkey. Probably more than 90% of the people will call themselves Muslim. A very small section of them would say we are Islamcı, which means Islamist. The distinction is, for the majority of Muslims, religion is about their personal piety, about community, about fasting in Ramadan, but it's not necessarily an ideology that defines the modern state. But Islamists are the group of people that emerged in the 20th century, by and large in the Muslim world, which created an ideology out of Islam, which refers to certain things that were there. It's not like that Muslims didn't have empires. Yeah, we had a history where you had states that interpreted Islam in certain ways and implemented Islamic law. But Islamists thought that this also gives a blueprint to implement and re-implement. And they brought in a lot of new ideas too. Actually, they borrowed some authoritarian ideas from Western ideologies, the bad ideologies, not the liberal one, but sometimes fascist or communist ideologies. And they created a theory of an Islamic state and wanted to enforce it and establish it. So I'm critical of that as a Muslim. I don't think Islam itself gives us a political blueprint. Yes, there were caliphs in the past, but they were there to establish justice. Some of them did okay, some of them did terribly. So today I would look into the world, I would say, well, Muslims need decent states that protect their rights, including their religious freedom, their property, their lives. And sometimes non-Muslim states do it better than so-called Islamic states. And that's why you have Muslims escaping from some of those so-called Islamic states to liberal democracies, to UK or Europe or North America. So I think Islam doesn't give us that. Those groups have that belief. And even I would say not Islamists are all the same. There are Islamists that have a bit more democratic tendency. We've clearly seen that positive trend in Tunisia, in the Ennahda party and its leader Rashid Ghannouchi, which is almost like liberal-leaning idea. So that's a good side of the spectrum. And there are really more totalitarian Islamists, and some of them tend to be violent, and that's the really concerning. There's a concern there, but to take that concern and then to define a really dark, have a dark vision of Islam, defining 2 billion people, that is unfair, and that's going to lead to terrible policies and perceptions, and we should be careful against that very simplistic and wrong view.
That's really interesting. So political Islam itself, this idea that through Islam as a faith, we can create an ideology that reflects the existence of the state and what the relationship between the state and the individual should look like. And you're saying that basically only emerged in the 20th century.
It is. It doesn't mean that we didn't have states that you can call. Sorry, the Ottoman Empire. Yeah, it was a state that defined itself as the caliphate for many centuries. But a lot of people can say, well, that was the past, and there's history in it. So not everything in history is religion, right? I agree with scholars like Ali Abdel Razak in Egypt or Said Bey in Turkey 100 years ago. They said the caliphate is a part of Muslim history. it's like, Christians had holy Roman empires and Charlemagne and, a lot of holy kingdoms. It's not Christianity as such that requires that. Now, in Islam, there's, of course, discussion that, Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, himself established a polity in Medina, a kind of a pre-modern state. Yes, he did. But I think, the argument from the non-Islamist side is, well, he did it because he needed Islam to survive in a very oppressive world. The first thing he wanted was just to preach Islam in his hometown, Mecca. He and the first Muslims were persecuted. That's why they had to flee and protect themselves. What comes to us from them is not a political blueprint, but values, but faith, but morals that are inspiring billions of people in the world in a good way. But it's not... And who's going to lead this Islamic State? There's no Prophet Muhammad anymore. There are no pious companions. Some autocrat will capture power and impose what he thinks as Islam. And that's going to be bad for many Muslims themselves. I mean, we've tested theory already over and over. So I think the future for the Islamic civilization, the better future, lies in establishing liberal states, liberal democratic states, and also preserving those liberal democratic states in the West. At a time, some people question them.
Absolutely. It's really interesting, especially as there seems to be alternative interpretations to that. So just very specifically with regard to Islam as a theology, you don't believe that it is necessary for there to be an Islamic state in order for Muslims to practice Islam?
Definitely. Actually, if the state is not Islamic, you have a better chance of practicing Islam in the way that you really believe. Because what we've seen in these Islamic State experiments, say Iran or Afghanistan under the Taliban, in Sudan, when the state is quote-unquote Islamic, it is basically captured by one group that think this is true Islam, and that they impose that true Islam on the citizens. And the citizens turn out to be having different views about Islam. And this one view, whatever that is, its view of heresy becomes official policy.
Yes.
So in Pakistan, Ahmadis, a unorthodox Muslim group. Some people even object, say, no, they're not Muslims. Well, that's why this is controversial, and just let's keep the state neutral. So in the beginning, Pakistan had a more neutral approach to religion, and it was more healthy. So there was a so-called Islamization project in the 70s and 80s that led to blasphemy laws and some definition of true Islam and heresy constitutionally that led to the persecution of a lot of innocent people in Pakistan. And I think the thing is, civilizations learn lessons by mistakes. The Western civilization had huge mistakes in its history, and a lot of people suffered from that. Religious wars, persecutions, the nationalism, fascism, Nazism. We've seen terrible things. And I think liberal solutions came out of those lessons as the right way to go. And today, I believe the Islamic civilization didn't have a good history. Didn't have a good recent history in the past 200 years. But these lessons are also educating Muslims. People are now saying, well, a state like Iran doesn't make sense. They enforce women to wear the headscarf. They end up by people hating the headscarf and burning it on the streets, whereas it should be a woman's choice to wear whatever she wants to wear. And I fully respect if a woman chooses to wear a headscarf or if she doesn't do that. And it's not the job of the government to dictate to them. Now, this argument is now more persuasive to even conservative Muslims than I think it was a few decades ago because they see the results, right? So I think there is a real concern about these Islamist movements that have totalitarian ambitions, that have definitely illiberal visions of society. I'm someone who argues against them. But I also worry that their vision of, very illiberal Islam will be taken as the only Islam by certain groups in Europe and West, and then they will demonize all Muslims and go after them, and that will make everything much worse for West itself and for the Muslim world too.
Absolutely, and it's certainly true that they are not the majority, but actually that there are alternative perspectives to this. You brushed on it already, but would you call yourself a classical liberal?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
So how do you think that classical liberalism and Islam are compatible or actually necessary in order to practice Islam? Ideas about individual liberty, free markets, even from an economic perspective, free exchange, freedom of expression, property rights. Why are those values so not just compatible with Islam, but actually necessary for it to exist?
They're compatible with they're compatible with the kind of interpretations of Islam that I highlight, again, there are other interpretations of Islam, just like there are interpretations of Christianity. I mean, if you ask a Catholic, what's the ideal state? They're Catholic integralists. They're kind of Islamists of the Catholic tradition who believe the state should be Catholic and kind of uphold the truth and punish heresy and sin. I hope they won't have. They had the upper hand in certain periods in history, right? I mean, that's why people escaped the Inquisition and, where there were dictatorships blessed by the Catholic Church in the 20th century, even. I mean, Franco and Salazar. I think the Catholic Church took a step forward with the Vatican II Declaration, and I think it was the Vatican II process and the dignity of humanity, declaration in the 60s. So I think that, so I'm just giving that as an example. Now, regarding Islam. So what was the question?
So with regard to how political Islam and the sort of the idea specifically that liberalism, classical liberalism, is compatible with faith.
Yeah, exactly. First of all, classical liberalism even has some roots in the Islamic tradition, I can say. Free markets, well, that's an Islamic tradition. I mean, actually, our friend Benedict Curler has this wonderful book, Early Islam and the Birth of Capitalism. Actually, Islamic civilization was very important in advancing certain concepts of economic liberty. The idea of a free trade, limited government, limited taxation, property rights. These were not unknown in Islam. Actually, one of the great theorists of limited government involvement in trade was Ibn Khaldun, the great medieval Islamic polymath. And his ideas later inspired Ronald Reagan to decrease taxes in America and promote free trade. And Reagan publicly quoted Ibn Khaldun. And I said, yeah, I mean, it's not like there is a isolated Western tradition that has nothing to do with Islam. There has been Islamic contributions to West, including Western liberalism. Ideas of free speech have some roots in the writings of Ibn Rushd or Averroes. I mean, he says, when you're going to refute an opponent, always quote him fairly first. Do not silence him. So that approach, that kind of dialectical approach led to further interpretations in Europe. So it's not like
we have that with the Prophet as well, right? The idea that, as a community, they have conversations and they decide sort of in a way democratically.
Yeah, shura. I mean, consultation, that's in the Quran, and that was interpreted as a basis for democracy in the 19th century and still onwards. Religious freedom. I mean, it's not unheard of Islam. Actually, I mean, there is no compulsion in religion. That famous Quranic verse, La ikraha fid din. Based on that, Muslims didn't forcibly convert Jews and Christians into Islam, which was, I mean, they didn't have equal rights with Muslims, but still just allowing them to practice their faith. That was a pretty liberal thing at the time. That's why there had been migrations to the lands of Islam from Europe, and it was very oppressive. So, liberalism is a tradition that developed over time, and I think it flourished further in Europe, definitely, in the way as we know it. But one thing, when I read John Locke for the first time, maybe 2 decades ago, A Letter Concerning Toleration, I was fascinated because I said, he's talking about our issues. Like he was writing about issues in the UK in the 1600s, but should there be a true religion, a right church that the government should promote, or the government should just be neutral and protect natural rights? Well, this is the discussion we're having in the Muslim world today. And the argument some of the argument Locke make for liberalism on religious grounds, for example, he says judgment should be left to God, theological judgments. And we should just live as civil society, different groups. Well, that's an argument you can make within Islam as well. And actually, there are theologians in early Islam called the Murjia. They were called the postponers because they postponed theological verdicts to afterlife to be resolved by God. So I kind of see these links between these traditions. It's undoubtable that liberalism flourished in the West more so, but I don't see liberalism as only exclusively a Western idea. And we can have liberalisms, and I think Islam is probably more closer to the West than most people think, because these religions have, Islam, Christianity, Judaism, Abrahamic roots. So idea of humans being created by God by certain rights, these are actually found in both traditions.
Yes.
It may be harder to argue in a cost system kind of worldview, for example, but I think So I do see roots of liberalism and chances for liberalism in the Islamic world, and I think we should just keep struggling for it.
It's absolutely fascinating, especially with some of your writings on early Islam. I mean, you've written about the Mutazilites and the idea that, in early Islam there were these kind of liberal traditions. Could you explain a bit about who they were and what that actually looked like?
Yeah, Mutazilites maybe were not liberal in the political sense, but they were rationalists. That's how they're known, that they emphasize the importance of human reason to find ethical right and wrong, even independent from revelation. They were the proponents of what I would call a natural law perspective in Islam, that through our reason, God-given faculties of conscience, humans can figure out what's right or wrong. Religion confirms those, but religion doesn't establish them out of nowhere, which means you can ethically have a connection with the rest of humanity. If people are not religious, they can be upright and moral people, and their moral philosophies can be interesting to discuss. And from that same rationalist strain in early Islam, soon the philosophers emerged. People who studied Aristotle, Plato, Galen, and translated them and further extended their work, sometimes corrected their approaches. That actually brought Greek philosophy back into Europe from Spain. They're out of Spain back, and Aquinas famously studied Aristotle through Arabic sources. Those Muslims didn't say, "Oh, Plato is an infidel. Oh, Aristotle is kafir." That's it. They studied because they thought, human mind, human reason, that's universal. So there are things to learn and engage with. So today, I'm telling Muslims, you shouldn't say John Locke is an infidel, or like a Hayek is just, or whomever you like. These are my maybe two favorite figures. But so I think Muslims can engage with the rest of humanity on major issues of philosophy, ethics, governance, politics, and they should not be dismissed. But you have a religious tradition too. So how do you actually reconcile them? That is an intellectual effort. There is a little bit of an insular thinking, unfortunately, that developed in later Islamic civilization and still continues today, especially in these circles that we call the Islamists. But that's not the only thing that Islamic tradition can offer.
This insular thinking that you mentioned, I think it's so incredibly common, especially actually in Western countries, in which I think a lot of recent migration has resulted in a lot of people wanting to cling on to their identity so much more strongly, and so they have to be more radical than the next person or more religious than the next person. And so there is that element of radicalism in that respect. And there's also a lot of finger pointing, saying, well, that's too westernized. You've got a Western view of X, Y, and Z. How do you think we counteract that? Taking your approach as a more moderate Muslim and as an interpreter of political Islam in that way, how do we then counteract this very insular narrative that, well, if you believe in liberalism, if you even the word liberalism is sort of seen as blasphemous in some of these circles, if you believe in liberty, you are somehow not a true Muslim. How do you counteract that?
First of all, that critique that, the Western people are thinking too Western. Well, how would they think? That's normal, right? I'm from Turkey. A lot of people think Turkishly, that's normal. Of course, if that is a black and white view of the world, always blessing itself and looking at others only with suspicion. So that is closed-mindedness. But it's normal that people have a certain civilizational tradition and are proud of the better parts of it, at least, but not being blind to the problems there as well. So I kind of sometimes find these critiques too much, in a sense that the West should be only ashamed of what it is. But I think with that perspective, every civilization should be ashamed of its dirty laundries, and we all have them, right? So I think it's sometimes unfair. It doesn't help, I think, conversation. But you're right to point out sometimes new problems emerge in Europe because some of the newcomers, immigrants, many of them adopted and were happy that they found freedom and opportunities in Western societies. But there was a counter trend of closing yourself to the outside world and even being more rigid than what you came from, like compared to the people in your homeland. That has happened, unfortunately. So it has to be discussed. It has to be discussed not with hate against Muslims, not with demonizing, Muslim communities, but understanding the complexities, helping them develop a sense of European Islam, a British Islam, an American Islam. I think America has done maybe a little bit better job in that, I think.
It does seem that is the case. I mean, honestly, I couldn't tell you, I couldn't necessarily name one popular, like very, very popular sheikh in the UK that is of a moderate strand of thought. I mean, in the US...
Well, there's Tim Winter, who I will see tonight.
Yes,
he's definitely...
There's not many, but they are not seen as the mainstream.
I don't know the UK scene that well, and I don't want to comment on it. I visited this country after 10 years for the first time, but I love it. And now it sometimes depends. I mean, people who come to a certain country come from sometimes the most parochial parts of their own country, and they bring a certain culture there. I mean, there have been terrible cases of female genital mutilation in the West. For the majority of the Muslim world, this is unknown. Like, I mean, nobody knows that. Nobody does that. But in certain parts of Northeast Africa, it is unfortunately a tradition mixed with religion, although it predates religion, predates Islam. And they think this is the right thing to do, and they've done it in the middle of the West. So that shocks, of course, Americans and Europeans. That would shock Turks or Indonesians or many other people as well. So sometimes there are kind of cultural trends like that. The thing is, there might be problems, and we should be honest about those problems. And I see ideological problems too. I mean, I see people saying, oh, liberalism is evil. It's the most evil. And I say, like, where do you live? Do you live in Kandahar? No, you live in London or Texas. Like, then you're living in liberalism. By the way, also, do you want the alternative to this? I mean, the alternative to this is not going to be a caliphate here. The alternative to this will be far-right, anti-Muslim, fascist almost kind of movements that are not unthinkable at this moment. I mean, we've seen that. So I think I debate with these people. So I had a debate at SOAS 12 years ago, whether liberal democracy is a good thing for Muslims or not, with someone who believes there should be a caliphate. So I disagree with them, but I also am quite concerned that certain groups also in Europe or in UK will look at them saying, you see, that's the problem. That's why we should decrease the number of Muslims. That's why we should expel them. That's why we should close down the mosques. You know, the analogy, communism was a threat to freedom, right? I mean, I think it was the greatest threat to freedom in the 20th century. Much bigger than Islamism. I mean, it had two superpowers, China and Russia, and nuclear. I mean, it controlled half of the world. But communism was not the only threat to liberty within the West. McCarthyism was actually a major threat in America, especially. With the pretext of communism, America itself lost its freedoms for a while. So Islamism is a problem, but the hype about Islamism against it can also lead to illiberal policies that can suffocate freedom in Western majority countries. Why? By going after Muslim minorities, cracking down on freedom, religious freedom, and freedom of expression. We should be aware of that. And I think if liberal societies can do one thing right for the future of liberalism, they can keep liberalism principled, robust, and alive. Because to protect liberty, we have to be illiberal. Well, it doesn't work that way. You will end up being illiberal, period.
I think you've just absolutely hit the nail on the head there. One particular example in the UK is where there are a lot of Sharia courts in the UK. Now, these are they're not legally binding. They are not legal courts. They are basically, we've got Jewish equivalents as well, but nobody necessarily has an issue with them. The Islamic courts are effectively for certain communities that would like to seek religious advice from them.
Yeah.
And as a counteract, sort of emotive with on the right seems to be this question of whether or not we should be shutting them down. But that in itself is incredibly illiberal, and you don't counter illiberalism with more illiberalism.
Exactly. No, I'm actually in my first book, Islam Without Extremes, that you mentioned, I showed those courts. Actually, they're called councils, maybe better, because they're not making legally binding decisions. They're not stoning people. Like, they kind of marriage. They are arbitration councils that allow Muslims to get together, a wife and husband, to divide inheritance or marriage or divorce issues, because people want to live by their tradition. Now, that tradition may be too conservative, if you ask me, but if people voluntarily do that, I have no problem with that.
And they have the freedom and the right to do so.
Yeah, that's what freedom is. I mean, freedom means some people can be very conservative, some people can be very secular and liberal. That's what it is, right? So actually, I've always shown that example to conservative Muslims. Look, do you want to live by the Sharia, your religious tradition? Because Sharia is like the halakha in Judaism. Like, I mean, it's also how you eat. I mean, I observe the Sharia because I don't eat pork in a limited sense, right? When I fast in Ramadan, that's a part of the Sharia too. So you want to live by it voluntarily? Oh, there's the UK example. You can have that. You don't need a Sharia state. You don't need an Islamic state. You need a liberal state that's pluralist, that is tolerant. In the UK, you can have that. So that's the ideal model. So I hope that model actually survives.
Yeah.
And Muslims see that if you want to live by tradition in a communal way, even, and I would, criticize some maybe patriarchal attitudes there to change within. But you're right that, I think those are legitimate institutions. If people go there voluntarily, there's no problem in that. If there's no coercion, there's no problem. That's my
Absolutely.
approach. Yeah.
And the clear point here is that actually, if you want to live your life in that way, the best way to have that freedom to do so is in a free society, is in a liberal democracy that we often see in the West.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Just to finish up, just my last question for you, Mustafa. In the UK, obviously, we have sort of questions of social cohesion, of integration, and the question of political Islam is really at the forefront of a lot of these discussions. What advice would you give to a British policymaker when having these conversations, but also being able to discuss the idea that Islam and a British liberal democracy is actually compatible?
First of all, preserve liberal principles. This is the country that gave us John Locke and Adam Smith, right? This is the country that, when Europe was, under the control of Nazism, preserved itself as a liberal democracy. There is British imperialism. I might have troubles there, here and there, but it's a country that has shown that people can come to this country, flourish in their religious traditions, pluralist. I've always preferred the UK approach to religion with the French approach, with all respect to my French friends, but I think laïcité sometimes has a liberal edge to it, like banning headscarves, things like that. I think don't help. It's an intrusion in personal liberty.
You have the freedom to cover your hair as much as you have the freedom to not cover your hair.
Exactly. And I admire the fact that in the UK, when you come to the border, you give your passport and the guy who checks it might be wearing a Sikh turban or, hijab, and they're all British. And I think that is beautiful. That free trade is beautiful, and, engagement with the world is beautiful. Of course, one thing that maybe provoked some illiberal right-wing attitudes has been this illiberal left approaches that, made identity politics a crusade of its own and kind of also denigrated the past of Western societies too much. And I think it created a reaction. So we're having a turbulence within Western democracies these days, demographic issues as well. But I think the alternatives to liberalism always come with a passion. There'll be a great leader who will just crush the enemies and save us and give us a glory. We've tried that. It doesn't work. So liberty, rule of law, free markets, free exchange of ideas, these are timeless principles that have been tested, and it allowed humanity to flourish in the pre-modern era too, but also in the modern era. So just preserve them. Don't give up on them. And then let's just deal with the issues, whatever they are. There are endless policy issues. I'm not an expert on any of those, especially when it comes to the UK. But I would say keep liberal democracy alive at a time when it is challenged by illiberal dictatorships, but also even illiberal forces in Western societies. And that is the best answer to Islamism too. Because one thing, the Islamists will win when Western liberal democracies are captured by far-right anti-Islam groups, because Islamists say, we were telling you this was all a lie. They don't respect us. They don't respect our religion. So when France bans headscarves, pro-Taliban people like that as an argument. They say, you see, governments can legislate, female dress. France does it. What's the problem that we do it? France does it in the same ferocity or like with the same scope of the Taliban. But if we keep liberty alive, it will be also a positive example that many people can look up to it, including in many Muslims.
That's absolutely true. I've lied. That's not my last question. This is my last question. You touched on it in your last answer, just about the economics of Islam, which I think is really, really fascinating, and it will be fascinating to a lot of our listeners. So the idea that Islam itself is, sort of the bedrock of that is free exchange, and obviously I'm thinking back to the bazaars of markets and people exchanging with one another value for value. Could you explain the relationship between Islam and capitalism?
Prophet Muhammad was the only businessman among the world's founders of great religions before becoming a prophet unexpectedly at the age of 40. He was a merchant traveling between Arabia and Syria and selling goods and bringing back. And many of his early followers were merchants. So when they became Muslims and spread this new religion, they had this mercantile ethic, and which is reflected in the Quran, which is a lot of terms of trade when it's speaking about even some theological issues. It's reflected in his sayings like 9 out of 10 of God's bounty and blessings out of trade. And Islam then quickly became a civilization spread with conquests. And, that was a thing of the time. I'm not blessing necessarily spreading with conquest, but that's what everybody was doing, from Byzantines to Persians. And Islam created this free trade network. And it was a center of the world trade from between India and Europe as well. And Muslims developed techniques like banking. I mean, the word check in English comes from the Arabic word sak for a reason, written document. Other limited company, the concept has some roots in the Islamic tradition. There are, academic books on this that are really important. Now, modern capitalism developed and further advanced these ideas. And I think there are arguments that at some point, the Islamic civilization didn't catch up. For example, the idea of a corporation as a legal personality was a late development in Islamic law. The Ottoman Empire brought that in the 19th century, but it didn't have a precedent before that. So that was a problem. There are issues about interest. I don't think all interest is condemned by the Quran. There are something called riba, but I think that's excessive usury. Not all banking interest, but many Muslims think all banking interest is a problem. But then you have, banking interest-free banking developed as an alternative. I mean,
and there's one that exists in the UK.
Yeah, exactly.
That I'm aware of.
Fine, totally. I mean, if you're entering the economy somehow, that's fine. I think. Economic liberalism is the least problematic area. Because many Muslims would intuitively say, "Yeah, Prophet was a merchant." Interestingly, Marxist-influenced Islamist ideas emerged again in the 20th century, like the Islamic Republic of Iran. Ayatollah Khomeini liked the Soviet Union. He liked the Soviet style of a government. He said just they had the wrong idea. If you create a Soviet-style state and inject Islam into it, that would be a wonderful.
Or the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt.
They got inspirations from the Marxist left, sometimes out of anti-imperialism, understandable to some extent, but it led to, I think, terrible results. But in Turkey, where I come from, there's been a long tradition of combining Islamic piety with market-friendly, even liberal. Turgut Özal, Turkey's, I think, greatest leader in the past 100 years, in 1980s, he introduced these three concepts of Turkey: freedom of religion, freedom of expression, and freedom of the markets. And that really is the secret of success of modern Turkey today, despite the regression in the past 10 years. So I think there are pockets of developments in the Muslim world where you already see some Muslim societies when going towards a liberal direction, not becoming full liberal, maybe democracies, but then they tend to do better in those times and in those trajectories. I think we should understand this whole complexity of it. And yes, definitely, Muslims never had a problem with markets and exchange. And I think we should just only push further for that in the modern era.
Mustafa, that has been an absolutely fascinating discussion. Thank you so, so much for joining me today. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you are interested in learning more about Mustafa's work, where can we find you? X?
You can find me on X, Akyol in English. That's my English Twitter account. Twitter or X. X now. On Cato Institute, my personal website gives all the writings or talks of mine and their links, I think. And they can find my books on Amazon or I think bookstores.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And thank you to all of you for watching and listening. If you're interested in learning more about the IEA's work, then do check out insider.iea.org.uk.